As I told you in the beginning of this case would be difficult to listen to. We also told you from the beginning we had no dispute whatsoever about the facts as to what happened to Hannah Driver on December 8th of 2020. We all agree that the events that occurred that day are nothing short of a tragedy. Ms. Driver never denied that she didn't harm Hannah Nicole Driver on that day. There's also no dispute that she stabbed herself in the neck over 5 times and once in the chest to try to kill herself. We also told you from the beginning, we're not going to argue about anything related to the facts of this case. This case has always been about Hannah and Chloe's mental state at the time of the crime. That is it. It is clear from the evidence that has been submitted to you that both the state and the defense have shown very clearly Ms. Driver was suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the crime. She was suffering from delusions telling her that she needed to die. There's evidence that she had documented mental health history prior to being involved with Mr. Joyce. There's eyewitness testimony about her condition and the subsequent deterioration in the months leading up to this tragedy. There's evidence that she had been seeking help, communicating to those immediately around her that she was getting worse. And she could not resist those compulsions. She could not distinguish right from wrong. Now, I would agree with the state that they put up a lot of evidence in this case related to Hannah's death. The ER doctor, the medical examiner, crime lab, all of that. All things that we never once disputed. In fact, we spent, I think, 45 minutes one day about listening to the testimony about fingerprints on a knife. It didn't even have anything to do with this case. There were no fingerprints on the knife. We weren't even disputing the fingerprints or the knife. We've never disputed any of that. We've never disputed cause of death. We've never disputed how law enforcement initially responded to this or any of the subsequent investigation that occurred in this case. See, in most cases, there's a factual dispute between the state and the defense as to the physical acts involved in a case and the mental intent. Never been an issue at this case. The only question has always been why. It has been about what led us to this deep, dark place. It has always been about Chloe Driver being a young, naive individual with a pre-existing mental health condition that had been previously undiagnosed, mostly based on her age. It has always been about the years of abuse, the coercive control, and living in this cult mentality that exacerbated these mental illnesses. All the experts agree. Ms. Driver was suffering from severe mental illnesses and delusions prior to, leading up to, and on December the 8th of 2020. You also heard from witnesses that described her and had observed that very same behavior well before that day and on that day as well. There's been evidence to show that she was in the throes of a severe mental health crisis during that 2-month period. There has been no evidence presented by anybody that this was an isolated snap or something that she is faking to achieve a particular result. 3 experts told you that. As I told you when I stood here before you in opening statements, I anticipated that they were going to present this case in a manner to draw at your raw initial emotions and hope that you would make those decisions based on those emotions. They presented this case in a manner in which they wanted you to ignore the evidence regarding her mental illness, her abuse, and all of the players involved in this case, and the realities of what goes on in that cult. They tried to paint this picture that this was just a group of wacky individuals with weird religious beliefs, that they were a peaceful, loving, polygamous family with some wacky religious beliefs. Not the case at all. Jason Spillers gave you a peek into their belief system. After over a week's worth of evidence, it is clear that everyone in law enforcement Everyone, including law enforcement, the experts, medical staff, people who were around her, and even the strangers that encountered Ms. Driver during this time. There is overwhelming evidence that she was severely mentally ill. We have given you several examples of documented red flag events that occurred prior to that date that set the scene for what ultimately happened. Think about the incident involving Sandra Torres. Think about when Benjamin took Hannah from Chloe Thanksgiving Day of 2020. Watch that video she made when she had to go back to get her daughter. The evidence shows that her condition deteriorated, the delusions not only continued, but got worse collectively over time, all building up to that day. We know that her mental state was broken, she was seeing things, she was hearing things, and the delusions were telling her over and over again she needed to die. Over and over and over again. Think about the pictures I showed you in the beginning of this case. The ones of her at 16, the ones of her in the summer leading up to this event. Ultimately, right before the event, where you can see where she is at that particular point in time. You can see the despair, you can see the stress, and you can see the mental illness in her eyes. See, there were signs that she was experiencing these delusions leading up to and on the day of the incident. There was discussions about death. She was seeing things associated with knives that she attributed special meaning to her because of that delusion. The 12 tribes, the dirty shirt. All of these delusions included the belief that she was sin, she was passing that sin on to her daughter, she needed to die, and Hannah was an extension of herself and her sin. She believed that Hannah was so connected to her and part of her that when she breastfed, she was imprinting and downloading all of herself into Hannah. She was experiencing these delusions in her mind that made her believe over and over again that she needed to kill herself and die. Based on her delusion regarding Hannah, she was thinking if she left behind her child, it would be a continuation of her sin and her false belief in that delusion that she was responsible for everything bad in the world. She needed to commit suicide. The act of suicide is what was driven by these delusions. It was not because of jealousy or anything related to Benjamin Ben Michael. Not at all. There's no evidence of that. Mystique told you in their opening that they were going to show that Miss Driver was not mentally ill. I think they said crazy in air quotes. That Miss Driver killed her daughter out of jealousy and some desire to be the only wife. She was not delusional. She just subscribed to some wacky religious conspiracy theories. And she was voluntarily part of this group and free to leave whenever she wanted to. There's been no evidence of that whatsoever. Let's talk about each one of these arguments and break them down. I'm not even going to address the assertion that they made in opening that she wasn't crazy. The evidence on its own speaks to that. There's no evidence that this event had anything to do with jealousy. There's no evidence that she killed her daughter because she wanted Benjamin to herself. The statements she made to law enforcement and hospital staff are not motives. She told Detective Cruz that she wanted a normal family. That's not an abnormal wish, but it's not a motive for murder. How does killing herself and Hannah achieve the result of having Mr. Ben Michael to herself? Or it's not logical. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not supported by the facts. She did not attempt to harm any of the other wives. She didn't attempt to harm Mr. Ben Michael. If she wanted to have him to herself, wouldn't she have gotten rid of the competition? If she was in her right mind, wouldn't she have taken steps to remove the others from the relationship? That seems to be a more logical response. Seems to me that she would have taken steps to stop those interfering with her wishes, not killed the child or herself. That argument defies logic. Jason also told us here there were no jealousy issues whatsoever within that group. Never any issues of Chloe acting out towards other women in the group, or that she made any demands to have Mr. Ben Michael to herself. Their own witness told you that. They were a happy family. They sat around talking about their feelings. They spent months trying to care for Chloe. There was no lack of attention. Killing Hannah and killing herself does not get Chloe attention. It does not get her alone with her husband. This was in no way a passive suicide attempt. If they had evidence to the contrary of how Jason portrayed their relationship in their life, state could have presented that to you. Ask yourselves why they did not. The state also argued that Chloe was free to leave at any time and not victim of domestic violence. And because she had access to money, she could come and go as she pleased, leave any time. They argued she could leave him with her daughter at any time. That argument goes against every ounce of training everyone sitting at that table has ever gone about the domestic violence cycle. There is evidence that Chloe had visible hearing injuries on at least 2 different occasions. They know from their everyday practice that victims engage in contact with their abusers despite knowing that they shouldn't be. They know their victims continue to contact their abusers, even when court orders are in place telling them not to do it. They continue to contact their abusers despite knowing what those people are capable of and go back to them repeatedly. They know that victims, in their experience, take steps to plan an escape, but they don't always execute that plan. They are trying to ignore the facts that are supported by their evidence that Chloe Driver was a victim of domestic violence, and she was trying to leave, and deal with that mental illness at the same time. They refuse to see her as a victim in this case because it just doesn't fit their narrative. I'm also just going to say this about domestic violence at the hands of Benjamin. Chloe was not his first, not his only, and certainly won't be his last victim. Gabriella told you how hard it was for her to break herself away from that relationship, both physically and emotionally. She told you about how controlling he was, the physical abuse she endured, the threats he made to her about leaving and never seeing her child again. You got to hear about that experience directly. You got to hear about the abuse, the control, the emotional connection, her feelings of worthlessness, and the difficulty from separating from him with a child. You heard her tell you that despite being subjected to all of those things, she would leave and come back to her abuser. It fits within the cycle of violence. It fits what happened in this case as well. You heard her tell you that it finally took her getting the strength and confidence and belief in herself and having the assistance of her family members to leave for good. And she never looked back. And what may seem relatively straightforward to us is inexplainable about why you would go back. You heard Detective Cruz here on cross-examination tell us in further detail just how hard it is for those types of relationships, especially with a child, to get away from their abuser. She talked to us about how it's not uncommon for women to return to their abuser, remain in contact, or try to find ways to leave, but just don't have the strength to do that. Both Gabriella and Chloe experienced significant trauma bonds with Mr. Van Eckel. They both kept going back to what they knew, what they could expect, instead of moving forward into the unknown. That doesn't even take into account the emotional connection or underlying mental illness. Now, the state's probably going to tell you that whatever happened to Gabriella just doesn't matter. It's not relevant to what happened with Chloe Driver or her mental state. It is 100% relevant because Gabriella endured the exact same treatment and she sat here and told you about it. It was exactly the same as that was described to evaluators, to law enforcement, all by Chloe Driver. These 2 individuals never talked about their own experiences with each other. Gabrielle told you that she had one contact with her where she tried to explain some of the things she endured and realized that she wasn't getting through to Chloe. Detective Cruz was the one that contacted Gabriella 6 days after this crime had occurred because she knew exactly what she was dealing with based on her experience and following the evidence of their investigation. The control, the power, and the degradation of 2 women by Benjamin. Thankfully, Gabriella was able to escape and did not have pre-existing mental health issues. Thank goodness she was able to protect her child. In the presentation of this case, the state has always minimized what has happened to Chloe leading up to this. They didn't want to discuss her self-inflicted injuries. They didn't put any pictures of that up in evidence. We did. They didn't want you to talk about any of that. They didn't want to discuss the controlling and abusive relationship. They want you to believe that none of it matters in the context of this case. They want you to ignore her cries for help, her behavior leading up to this, the reports about the things she was saying to these people, and her attempts to leave on November 25th and November 26th. Now keep in mind, this case was investigated from the very beginning by Detective Cruz with regard to Ms. Driver's mental state and from the perspective that Chloe was a victim. As Detective Cruz began this investigation, she immediately suspected there was a lot more to the story than she was getting from these cult members, long before Chloe could even have an opportunity to think of a defense. She sat in that hospital. She hadn't talked to anybody. Detective Cruz had already interviewed everybody. And based on that, you heard Detective Cruz tell you she had contacted other people. She had sought those Asheville police departments. She knew what she was dealing with. You watched videos where Chloe told you that she had been hurt, and where Chloe told Detective Cruz about her black eye. She told Detective Cruz about her paranoia, her state of mind, and you saw the videos of her saying she wanted to die with that baby. Based on that experience with law enforcement with DV victims, she continued to investigate that case. She found additional women, she found those police reports, and more evidence of what that world that Chloe was living in. Now, you also heard from Jason Spillers, and that was quite a treat. He was able to paint a picture of this group in two very different ways. First, he was able to tell you about how he knew Chloe, how he knew her to be a loving, caring mother who loved Hannah and did everything for her. He knew her before she decompensated and spent so much time with the group that he knew exactly who Chloe was and what she was like. He told you about the different times he saw her, the changes he noticed, and even talking to Benjamin about getting her treatment. He told you that the group spent the better part of the last 2 months leading up to December 8th of 2020 taking care of Chloe. He told us about her episodes and how she would have these episodes or go catatonic and have no idea what had just happened. That there were dramatic changes just in the time that he knew her. And it wasn't jealousy. It was mental illness. Secondly, I don't know if he intended to do this or not, he painted a very clear picture for you of what life was really like in this group. You could see how he idolized Benjamin. He endorsed all of his beliefs and the life that came with it. It was clear that he and Benjamin viewed women as property, as lesser individuals. He told us that the women are subservient and that they were not capable of having the same conversations as men. I think he used the words, they should be off frolicking and dancing with the babies. He told us that, yep, Benjamin set the standard, and that is what everybody had to live by. He tried to paint a picture of this wild alternative reality that no one was buying about polygamy. We know that he disputed that incident with Sandra Torres. Think about this. If he punched a total stranger for attempting to help Chloe that day, can you imagine what these men do to these women behind closed doors? If Jason is that crazy, can you imagine how his leader is? Ask yourself why they did not let you hear from Benjamin. They didn't call him because they know exactly who he is. The facts of this case are undisputed, so let's get down to the experts. Now, we've all heard from 3 different experts in this case. They all agree she was severely mentally ill in the months leading up to the event. They all agree she was suffering from delusions at the time leading up to this. Dr. Garrett and Dr. Ballard both diagnosed her with schizoaffective bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. We heard this morning that Dr. Zom did not offer any individual diagnosis. That's just her approach to this. But she told you today that she didn't disagree with those. In fact, she agreed with them, maybe a slight variation. They all utilized the same resources and collateral information to conduct their evaluations. Both Dr. Garrett and Dr. Ballard told you that even outside of Chloe's self-report, the information provided among those sources of information was consistent and independently verified. Those doctors did not believe she was malingering or presenting in any way to achieve a certain result. The experts have told us that these delusions are defined as a fixed false belief that someone holds on to, even when the evidence shows that there's no way they can be real. They cannot be explained outside of mental illness. They are so unusual that they cannot be explained other than disordered thinking. That delusional compulsion that Ms. Gropper was talking about is defined as if that delusion had been real, it would have justified the conduct. Her delusions in this case were not religious in nature. She believed everyone was out to get her. She believed she had special powers. She believed she had magical thinking about things that she thought she did that impacted the world, that she was receiving specific messages directed at her. Those messages came both in auditory and visual hallucinations, but also those delusions of reference that were referenced by both of the doctors. Delusions are not things that are in line with a person's culture, and everybody knows them to be false. They are not extreme religious beliefs. A delusion that drove Ms. Driver to the point we're at today was the one that you heard from Dr. Garrett and Dr. Ballard and Dr. Zom, was that she needed to die. That is not part of any religious belief system. Those are not agreements for participation in any cult. All the experts agree on this. Now, I know you all sat here and paid attention to all of these experts, and I'm not going to go through everything that they have all talked about, but here's what I want to talk about with respect to each one of those. Dr. Garrett told us that the signs and the depth of her mental illness was ever present, that they existed before her relationship, and that she had been experiencing delusions since adolescence. That's important. That contradicts the state saying that she didn't experience delusions, that this is all made up. Dr. Garrett also told you that she was exhibiting those signs of those visual and auditory hallucinations even after being medicated for over a year and a half. When she met her, she was still exhibiting those signs of that delusional thinking. She was still having issues with suicidal ideation and thoughts that she needed to die. She told us it was clear she was experiencing emotional distress regarding the situation and confusion about the moral and ethical appropriateness of her delusions. She said, Ms. Driver said, I was at peace with how it was supposed to be. You heard that Dr. Garrett believed that she felt she needed to take her life because of her delusions, and everything in the world was telling her, in her mind, that's what she needed to do. Not just because of the delusions about sin, but because of all of those delusions of reference that she was seeing on a daily basis. That she was being told she needed to die. She would see a light bulb, she could see a knife, she could see all of these things that to you and I would mean nothing. But because of the disordered thinking and those delusions, it was feeding into her thought process and delusions. She told us that these delusions were above and beyond any religious teachings or anything that Mr. Ben Michael had ever told Chloe. Religious beliefs don't tell you you need to die. She also told you if you take someone who is vulnerable, who is already delusional, and bring them into this type of scenario and start teaching them crazy stuff, you are teaching them something that will only lead to an increase in their problems. Dr. Garrett also told us that Chloe started out as a very vulnerable young lady who was already delusional to begin with, having these thoughts. She also told us somebody that has a personality disorder, a mood disorder, and substance abuse was her baseline. These things existed prior to her ever getting involved in this relationship, and that those circumstances only made this scenario worse. She also told us to think about this as not a particular moment in time. Ms. Gropper tried to ask her about the dirty shirt as a trigger, and Dr. Garrett quickly corrected her and said, no, you have to consider all of these signs. And she went through and she listed those signs. She told us that we have to look at this as a culmination of events, not something as a trigger. Now, Dr. Ballard came here yesterday and told us a lot of the same information that Dr. Garrett did. She diagnosed the defendant with the same illnesses and, in her opinion, believed the acts were driven by that thought process. She told us that some of the things that the state seems to believe were deliberate acts or tries to persuade you to believe were things that she premeditated and thought out in her head before doing it, are actually acts in support of that delusional compulsion. They were acts that were in her mind to finish out what she was being told to do, that she needed to not die. Getting a knife and locking the door are acts that can be attributed to carrying out that delusion, is a way to act on that compulsion that kept telling her she needed to kill herself. That's an explanation that's rooted in science and in psychology. She told us that these people in delusional states can do everyday things that appear like it's normal. She also told us that these Google searches show that Miss Driver was attempting to resist acting on those compulsions to the best of her ability. She sought ways out. She sought ways to get help. She was also able to explain to you from the psychological standpoint that the statements made by Chloe to law enforcement after the incident don't necessarily mean anything when you're talking about the mental state at the time of the crime. She also talked about the jail calls and continued communication that Chloe had with Mr. Ben Michael, and explained it in the context of not only Chloe's mental health issues, but in the context of her experiences while she lived in that relationship. The state played you a few phone calls in this particular case, all including her mother. What it tells us, based on those calls that you listened to, is the true depths of her mental illness and her entanglement to him. The jail calls you listened to still show that even when she was incarcerated, she was still controlled and manipulated by him. Notice how they didn't play any of the conversations with Mr. Ben Michael. She also told us that people who are mentally ill, who have not received therapy, who have not been properly medicated, make irrational choices. The jail is not a therapeutic environment, and that to treat all of Chloe's issues, a great deal of treatment was needed, not just medication, to break that bond. Her testimony, Dr. Zom testified today, really didn't dispute any of the other two doctors in this case. She told you that Chloe was suffering from the same type of delusions and mental illness in the months and leading up to this event. All the doctors are consistent with that understanding of her severe mental illness. They all agree that it was untreated, and based on their diagnoses, would only get worse the longer it remained untreated. Each of those doctors agreed that the delusions that Ms. Driver experienced grew more and more pointed to the idea that she needed to kill herself and ultimately her child. Dr. Zom also agreed that the specific delusions that Chloe was experiencing on December the 8th culminated in the final delusion regarding the dirty shirt, and that was a sign she was unable to overcome. Now, I just want to talk briefly a little bit about the treatment of the experts in this case by the District Attorney's Office, and I think that this needs to be discussed. Mr. Fogus spent a lot of time yesterday with Dr. Ballard trying to emphasize some perceived bias as a defense expert. Neither Dr. Ballard, nor Dr. Zom, nor Dr. Garrett have any interest in this case other than providing you an expert professional opinion regarding her mental state at the time the crimes were committed. They have all told you that their roles in these cases is not based on reaching a particular result. No defense attorney ever contacts them or contacts any expert and asks them, hey, we need you to do a particular thing for us. At the end of the day, all of the doctors who shared all the same title and the same qualifications, in essence, reached the same general ideas in this particular case. If any of these evaluators believed that she did not suffer from mental illness or had these delusions, none of us would be here today. This is just not how these evaluations work. Now, I think it's important when we talk about Dr. McClendon that you all realize we called her as a witness in our case. The state didn't call her. She became involved in this case because she is employed by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. She works for the state. She was provided all of the information in this case that the state could give her to review prior to talking to Ms. Driver. Whether or not Ms. Cropper or Mr. Fogus want to acknowledge it, she was their expert. And their expert agreed with Dr. Zom, and Dr. Ballard. She worked for the state. We didn't involve her in this case. We had no choice in Dr. Garrett. See, in response to our evaluation, Ms. Gropper sent a referral to the Department of Behavioral Health. Now granted, Ms. Gropper doesn't get to pick which particular forensic psychologist is assigned to evaluate a defendant. But in this case, the state's own expert, the one who conducted the evaluation on behalf of the state of Georgia, sat up here and told you similar things that Dr. Ballard came in here and told you. Did you see Mr. Fobus or Ms. Gropper attack Dr. Garrett personally when we called her as a witness? No. And she made very similar findings and told you about that here in court. If they didn't like any of the reports in this case, the state could have at any time in the last 3.5 years requested an evaluation by a doctor of their choice. I ask you this, would it have mattered? The answer to that question is no. They all agree she was severely mentally ill and suffering from these delusions. She needed to kill herself and her child. They just don't like that the experts don't align with their theory of this case. Now, the experts are hired to conduct an evaluation in the area of their expertise. They don't give you a particular result. It's not how the system works. Dr. Ballard told you she's done a lot of criminal responsibility evaluations, and maybe less than 10% of those evaluations have yielded an opinion of not guilty by reason of insanity. Dr. Garrett told you she works for the state of Georgia and testifies for both the state and the defense. And yet they came in here and told you similar things. If the Cherokee County District Attorney's Office believed that none of these doctors conducted a thorough and accurate assessment of Ms. Driver in the last 3.5 years, they could have done something about it. The state knows what we all know in this case, that if Chloe was in her right mind, she would never have killed that baby. If Chloe had gotten the help she needed, she would have never harmed her baby or herself. If Chloe had not been in an abusive, controlling relationship with a man more than twice her age, her already existing mental health issues could have been treated. There is absolutely no motive in this case to kill her daughter or herself. There is no reason other than what was related to those psychotic symptoms and delusions she was under on December 8th of 2020. It is now your job to set aside those emotions about the death of Hannah. The evidence shows at the time of the crime, she was not only suffering from delusions that were telling her she needed to die, but that she didn't have the ability to distinguish right from wrong. While in this delusional state, the experts told us that everything in her mind was telling her that she needed to die. There's evidence that showed she tried to resist giving in to these thoughts. There is evidence that showed she did not, in these delusions and altered states of mind, she didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know what right from wrong. There is evidence to show that because of her delusions telling her that she and Hannah needed to die, that she was overmastered by the constant voices telling her, you need to die, in her head, and ultimately acted on them. All of this started with undiagnosed and untreated mental illness that resulted in a truly horrible, tragic act. Let me put a few things in perspective that may have helped prevent this from happening in the first place. If Benjamin, Sarah, and Jessica or Jason had gotten Chloe help instead of CBD, or ignoring the reality that was right before their eyes every day, Hannah may still be alive. If the Asheville Police Department had arrested Jason and Benjamin on November 25th for the incident where they assaulted Sandra Torres that day, Chloe may have been able to get away and get the help that she needed, and Hannah may be alive today. If Brian had not taken Hannah from Chloe on November 26th of 2020, when he found out her parents were coming to get them, it's fair to say that she might have been able to break away from that relationship if he hadn't left with her daughter. Chloe was never going to leave without her daughter. You heard testimony from Chloe's mom about how she had no idea about the extreme nature of this relationship until it was too late. They didn't have any idea about the mental health struggles. She didn't confide in them because he had convinced her that she couldn't trust her own parents. Every single day, her parents live with regrets and think about those what ifs. What if they had just tried harder? What if they had called the police? What if they had just taken Hannah? It replays in their mind over and over again. Her parents still say, if we had tried harder to get through to Chloe, Hannah may still be alive today. Look at all the times that Chloe was unable to address these significant mental health issues. Those failures led to a deep and darker mental state. They caused Chloe to lose her way as a mother to this child. To that end, I agree with the state. She failed in her ultimate responsibility to protect her child. But the failure of her motherly duties was caused entirely by her untreated mental health crisis. It is clear that but for that paranoia, her hallucinations and her delusions, Chloe loved her daughter. And she fought in every way she knew how, and in the circumstances she was in, to resist those delusions to kill herself and her child. But when those things kept happening to her over and over and over again, and were so pervasive in her mind, that's all she could see. She tried to fight it. She was voicing these concerns to everyone. She was telling these people, let me be with her. Help me, get me help. We can see it on December the 8th. We can see that she was having these delusions beginning with the 12 tribes, associating the discussion that they were having that day about death as a sign that reinforced that earlier delusion. We talked about the paranoia that she experienced at Whole Foods, the delusion about that room in the house, and being alone, and that ultimate final delusion of the dirty shirt that overwhelmed her ability, and she gave in. Now the court's going to give you instructions regarding the law for you to consider in this case. It is now your job to apply that law to the evidence that you have heard over the course of the last week. As Ms. Grauber kind of touched on briefly, you're going to be given a verdict form that allows you to decide this case in 4 different ways. The not guilty, guilty, guilty by mentally ill, or not guilty by reason of insanity. In order to find Chloe guilty of the charged offenses, you need to find that she committed the acts and that she had the required intent. And the state has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge will charge you about what it means to find someone beyond a reasonable doubt. The option of guilty but mentally ill does not yield the same results as a not guilty by reason of insanity. And I want you to keep that in your head. A finding of not guilty by reasonable insanity, and the judge is going to give you an instruction on this, allows this court to maintain the custody and control over an individual for the evaluation and treatment of her mental health needs. And that can be indefinite. The law allows a person to be found not guilty by reason of insanity if they did not have the mental capacity to distinguish between right and wrong at the time of the crime. The law allows this because of mental disease, she acted in such a way that delusional compulsion overwhelmed and overmastered her will to resist. Now, we've all talked about the delusions of what a delusional compulsion really is, but in this case, she was compelled to act in this manner because in her mind, she believed she was right. She believed if the facts were as she believed them to be in her head, she was right. The testimony you've heard in this case was that these delusions were directing her to die. As evidence to show that she experiences these delusions of reference, these auditory and visual hallucinations, these command hallucinations, paranoia. You heard testimony that Chloe believed based on that delusion, she was downloading all of herself into Hannah and viewed her as an extension of herself. You heard Dr. Ballard tell you that people with these type of disorders have a very difficult time distinguishing boundaries or when one person ends and another begins. You've heard testimony that people suffering from the same illnesses as Chloe are often unable to distinguish the boundaries. She didn't necessarily know where Hannah began or ended. She didn't know where she began, where she ended. She viewed her, in her mind, as one unit. She was not going to leave behind any piece of her in this world to perpetuate that ongoing sin, which told her she needed to die. It is all part of the delusion. Now, the state began their opening statement, and again today, asking you for justice for Hannah. We agree. There is justice for Hannah in this case if you find her not guilty by reason of insanity. There is no doubt that our client committed these horrific acts. Never contested that. I want to be clear, though, that in this case, justice looks different than what we're used to. Our society has certain ideas about mental illness and has created a very strong perception that mental illness is an excuse for someone who commits a crime. The law recognizes that severely mentally ill people cannot perform the required criminal intent to commit a crime. The law allows you to find Chloe not guilty by reason of insanity if you believe at the time of the crime she was suffering from mental illness and that she did not have the ability to distinguish right from wrong. You're also allowed to find her not guilty by reason of insanity if you believe that due to her mental illness, she was suffering from a delusional compulsion that overmastered her will to resist committing the act. We know that Miss Driver was in a delusional state. She was confused as to what was right and what was wrong, and resisted acting on those delusions for a long time. In that type of mindset, in the throes of a severe psychotic episode, there is no way she had the ability to distinguish right from wrong at that time. And she was left untreated. And she got worse and worse. Now, Ms. Grabber talked to you a little bit about the delusional compulsion part of that, but we know from the evidence in this case that she was severely mentally ill, that she was suffering from delusions that compelled her to act in a particular manner. That if right, that would have been right if they had been as she believed them to be. If you find that Ms. Driver, based on those delusions, that she believed her actions were right, and as she believed them to be, she would be justified. The evidence has been clear that she needed to kill herself, and by extension, Hannah. She could not separate her identities at that particular time. Now, I want to tell you, suicide in and of itself is not a crime. In her mind, she was being told to kill herself and any part of her. Her intention, based on those delusions, is to follow through on that. And the delusions were telling her to commit suicide. Those right actions in her mind are what led to those events. As I told you, this case has always been about the why. And I think you just need to think about this in the context of how we got here today. Chloe was a young, naive individual with pre-existing mental health issues. She already walked in with that baseline to this relationship. She suffered years of abuse, coercive control, and a cult mentality. We've heard about she asked for help, she cried for help, and attempted to leave. We've heard that all the experts agree that she was suffering from severe mental health issues, and that untreated, undiagnosed individuals treating those type of illnesses get worse over time. They just don't go away. As we told you in the beginning of this case, mothers just do not kill their children. We told you to ask yourself what drives someone to do something like this to their baby and themselves. What drives someone to stab themselves 5 times in the neck and once in the heart? What drives someone to do this by someone who, all reports, loved and cared for that child in the most amazing way? And the only explanation is those severe psychotic symptoms and delusions she was experiencing. Now, I want to be clear. A finding of not guilty by reason of insanity does not mean that she walks out of this courtroom or is not held accountable for her actions that day. It means that she is committed to the state hospital to get the treatment she needs. Justice in this case for Hannah is getting her mother the treatment she so desperately needs. A verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity is not an excuse. It is a way the law allows an individual in Chloe's position to be held accountable based on those things. It is the why. It does not mean she's not held accountable. It does not mean there's no justice for Hannah. It means she gets the treatment and the help she needs. The only verdict in this case supported by the evidence to each and every count on that indictment is not guilty by reason of insanity to each and every count, because we have met the burden that we have that she could not distinguish right from wrong, and that she was overcome and overmastered by those delusional compulsions that in her mind justified that act. Thank you.